if you are a veteran or you serve in the military, I would love for you to stand up right now. There you go. Just go ahead and stand up. Don't be shy. We are grateful for you. We thank God for you, and certainly pray for those who are, especially in active duty, who are serving us even as we speak. So thank you. All right, well, speaking of military, we're in a series called Make War, and we've been in this for several weeks now, and we're thinking about a different kind of war than what we might typically think of as this person-to-person kind of a war that we might engage in with military forces and all of that. We're talking about the kind the Bible talks about, that there is a spiritual battle that is going on all the time around us, and Paul, especially in the New Testament, kind of brings to light the idea that there's a battle that's raging that we don't see, but it affects what we do see and how we live our lives, and we need to be fully aware of that and be prepared to deal with it. And so in Ephesians chapter 6, he gives us some encouragement and some equipping to help us know how to do that as followers of Christ, how to go into this world and engage the darkness and be protected from it and from the enemy and all that he has to throw at us. And so he goes through a list of things that we need to wear. In other words, like armor. Taking a page out of the Roman soldier, he starts talking about armor that we should be wearing as believers. And he first talks about the belt of truth, and we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. That truth is the core and the center of who we are as believers. You know, a truth in who God is and how much he loves us, and a truth in the gospel and all that. And so we talked about that, and we talked about the breastplate of righteousness and how important that is to protect our heart. And then last week, Lee did a great job talking about fitting ourselves with the shoes of the gospel and keeping that good news with us and around us all the time as it takes us to different places. This morning, we're going to go on in this sort of the next piece of armor that Paul is talking about. It's found in verse 16. And this is what he says, Ephesians 6:16. He says, in addition to all of this, in other words, in addition to all the other pieces that I've already mentioned, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take up the shield of faith. Now, going back to the Roman soldier, in addition to all the other things that he was wearing, the shield was an incredibly important piece of his armor as a defense against the enemy. Now, I got a picture. You may remember the first week I talked a little bit about this formation that actually allowed the Roman army to dominate the world. And as you can see, they would get in this formation together, kind of like almost a square unit. And the ones in the front and the ones on the sides all have their shields out. And then the ones in the middle put theirs up top. And they were virtually an impenetrable unit. And this was a very important formation for their whole army when they went into battle. Now, one thing that I mentioned before is that the beauty of this is that on the inside, and you can't really see it with these shields right here, but we know that the Roman soldiers' shields had flanges on the sides that would allow them to link together so that they could become even more of a solid unit. And I'll get back to that part in just a minute. But these shields were typically in that day made of wood and leather. Wood and leather. Not some metal that was studded on there, but mostly it was wood and leather. And what they would do is they would take these shields and they would plunge them in water for a certain amount of time and soak them so that when they went out to battle, they knew that the enemy was more than likely going to fling flaming arrows at them. And when those arrows would hit those shields, they would stick, but because they were moist with that water, they would either extinguish or they just wouldn't burn. And so that was a very important part of their defense. They were so intentional and strategic about every little detail of what they did. And again, that's what caused them to be such a force in that day. So their armor was critical, but the shield was very critical to helping them be successful in battle. So Paul takes kind of a page out of that part of the Roman soldier. And he says, you know what, kind of like that shield that's so very important to that soldier and to their unit. The follower of Christ also needs a shield. And the shield that we carry is a shield of faith, is what he says. Faith is that thing that protects us. Faith is that important part of who we are as followers of Christ that helps protect us from the enemy, and it helps us move forward as a follower of Jesus. So for just a few minutes, what I want to do is just talk about this faith. What does it look like? What does it mean for us? How does it work in our lives. If you go in the New Testament over to Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, you'll find there what I can only describe as the handbook of faith. The writer takes a whole chapter and dedicates it to this whole idea of trusting the Lord, having faith in Him in all circumstances. But here's what he says. Here's the definition that he uses in verse 1 of Hebrews 11. He says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. So it's like this. Faith is that I have confidence in what I'm hoping for. In other words, we might think about God and what He puts out in front of us in our life. I'm hoping for maybe a better day beyond this one. That may be a tough one. I'm hoping for that end of my life, that there is heaven and that I will spend eternity in there. I'm hopeful, and I have assurance of that by what God has promised me. But then he goes on to say, and I also not only have confidence in that, but I have the assurance of something I don't see, because I don't see any of that. I can't physically see this day that's coming. I don't physically see heaven yet. I don't physically see how God is going to work this thing out in my life. But He's told me He would, and I have a promise. And so I'm going to live with that promise. That's what faith is. It's trusting in someone and something we don't see, but believing that He is good and that He will take care of us. So think about it like this. And I always, whenever I talk about the issue of faith, I know there are a lot of people, and maybe even you this morning, who are skeptical of faith. They're like, I don't know, man, just kind of having faith in everything. I don't know about that. Well, let me tell you something. I believe that no matter who you are, we all have faith in something. It takes faith just to live life. Would you agree with me on that? For example, you get on an airplane. My son is in the flight program at Auburn, so I'm thinking about this often. But when you get on an airplane, I bet 9 out of 10 people do not sit down and start thinking about Bernoulli's principle of flight. They don't sit down and they think about this whole issue of wind that goes over the top of a wing at a certain speed creates a low pressure situation below the wing, and because of that low pressure, it creates lift, and that's how a plane gets off the ground. I mean, it's an amazing principle. It's what allows a plane that weighs thousands and thousands of pounds to get up in the air and carry you from one country to the next. Bernoulli's principle. Write it down. But I bet you don't write it down when you sit there before you take off. Hey, guys, everybody in the cabin, let's go through Bernoulli's principle before we, nobody thinks about it. You don't think about that pilot. Did he have a good day? Did he have a bad day? Does he actually know everything he's supposed to know about flying? Did he forget about this new piece of equipment? I mean, I don't know, maybe you do think about that. Maybe you're one of those paranoid flyers who's like, oh no, I think about that. I go interview him before we fly now. But more often than not, we are trusting that everything has been worked out. Pilot knows what they're doing. The Bernoulli's principle is actually going to work. It's not going to fail me as we go across the ocean. It's going to take me where I need to go. I have faith in that, even though I don't declare it. I just do. Or you get into an elevator. You don't think about that cable up there. Is that thing frayed? Have you checked that? Is it worn? Is it 40 years old and we don't know how that thing's going? You probably don't even consider the maintenance on there. You just get in and I'm going to think about it now. Every time I get in an elevator, you're like, thanks, Rusty. But you get in that elevator and you press that button and you just believe this elevator is going to take you from here to the 8th floor and then it's going to take you back down and you're going to be fine. Because why? Because we just have faith that it does. We don't question it. We don't run around, checking on everything. So if we can have faith in all of these simple areas of our life, why is it so hard to trust in God who created the plane and the elevator and the principles of Bernoulli and the physics and everything? Sometimes we just find ourselves having a hard time believing and trusting in Him, and yet that's the one that we should be believing in more than anything. He's the one who sustains our life, that will take care of us no matter what. But we don't see Him. Sometimes we don't see how things are going to work out with Him, but that's where we have to trust Him. Now, in this passage, Hebrews 11, the writer goes on and he starts listing all these people from way back in the Bible. He goes all the way back to the beginning. And so he lists people like Abel. Remember Cain and Abel? Cain kills Abel, it's not good, all this kind of situation. Well, anyway, God called them at some point to offer sacrifices to Him. And Cain always brought these meager sacrifices that weren't really reflective of the honor that God should be showed. But Abel, on the other hand, he brought a sacrifice that was genuinely a sacrifice. It says that he would bring the best of his flocks to God. And these were the unblemished, the best lambs, the things that he depended on to live. And he would bring those to the Lord and sacrifice them for the Lord. Why? Because he trusted God. because God had already proven he would take care of him. And it says in there that God honored Abel for his sacrifice. He talks about Enoch. Enoch was a guy who walked with God. And because he trusted God, God was pleased with his faith. He talks about Noah. Remember that guy? God comes to him and says, hey, Noah, I need you to build a boat. See you later. And Noah's like, we're not even close to water. No lake, no ocean. Why am I building a boat? It's going to rain. It's going to be a flood. Trust me. You want to build a boat. So Noah's like, all right, I'm going to build a boat. So he builds this boat. And what happens? People make fun of him. They're like, Noah, why are you building this boat? What is wrong with you? Have you gone insane? And he endures all this struggle and trouble from the community. But he builds the boat. And what happens? It rains for 40 days and nights, and it floods. And those people were like, oh, he was right. Can I get in your boat? Too late. But Noah trusted the Lord, and the Lord honored his faith. And God went to Abraham. And he said, Abraham, I need you to leave your homeland and your people, everything that you know, and go to this foreign land. Why? Don't worry about it. Just trust me. Really? Okay. Abraham trusted the Lord. And he moved everybody over to this foreign land. And then later, remember he has a son. The only son, the promised son, the miracle son. Isaac. And then God comes to him. And he says, Abraham, I want Isaac. I want your son. Now you can imagine all the questions in Abraham's mind. Really? The one that the promise, the miracle? Yes, I want that son. And Abraham had some faith. And he said, okay. And he took his son up that mountain, prepared to sacrifice him. And God said, stop. Okay, Abraham, you've proved your faith worthy. You've passed the test. And I honor your faith. See, that's how this thing has worked from the beginning of time. And it's like people didn't know where they were being led oftentimes. They didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what was going to happen when they got there. They didn't understand why their circumstances were so difficult. They didn't see everything. And yet at the end of the day, they knew this fact that God was good and that they could trust him to take care of them. And that's all they needed. So why do we have this list of all these people? And it goes on and on and on. You can go read it for yourself. It's because you know what? We need to be encouraged by other people's faith sometimes, don't we? We need to read about other people who stuck it out and trusted the Lord in difficult times, because it is a testimony to us. I mean, how many people in your life can you say, gosh, I remember so-and-so. Maybe they're older people who lived a tough life, but they trusted the Lord and they stuck with him, and that meant something to you. I can list all kinds of people. Well, let me give you an example just of how this works, even in our own church. There was, if you remember a couple of months ago, we showed a video up here of a single mom, Missy Shoebake. And she was talking about her faith. And she was talking about, what it's like to raise kids and try to pass that faith on to them. And she was sharing her story, and it was just such a great story about how she would get them up in the morning. She would have devotional time with them, and very committed to that. Well, while this video is running over at our Lee Scott site, there's one family in particular that's paying close attention, and specifically a dad named David. David's watching this video, and he is just deeply moved by her story and the way that she's raising her kids and raising them alone, and yet she's working hard to give this faith to them. And he's so inspired by it that he decides, you know what? I've got to start doing this with our kids. So he starts getting his kids up early before school, teenagers, come on, gets them up and starts having devotion time with them before school. And I'm sure they're like, thanks a lot for that video, church. Way to go. But anyway. And he starts passing this faith on to them. So moved by hearing somebody else's story. See, that's how this works oftentimes. You see, I need to hear your story because it inspires me and challenges me. And you need to hear mine. And y'all need to hear each other's. Because that's how this faith thing works with us. It's meant to be shared. It's meant to be passed along. It's something that is vital to our life. Now, there's two, modes or ways of living this faith out. It's the way I see it. One is that we do this faith individually. We as individuals need to own our faith in Jesus Christ for ourselves, right? Because at the end of the day, or literally at the end of our life, we stand alone. We don't have our spouse there or our kids there. You don't have your pastor, lawyer, Rusty, to testify on your behalf to say, hey, good person, they're great, let them into heaven. You know, no, we stand up there before the Lord and we answer for the faith that we have individually. And so how we handle our faith matters to us, because literally our individual faith is what saves us. Saves us. Quick story, there were 3 guys who were standing around having a conversation one day, and somehow, strangely, this conversation turned to death. And they started talking about things like their funeral, and one guy said, what would you want said about you at your funeral, once you're gone? And the one guy was like, well, I really wish that they would talk about me as somebody who just loved everybody, who loved people and was involved in our community, and I really wish they would say that about me. I'd like that. Another guy said, well, I really wish that they would talk about the fact that I was a good father and a good husband, and that I love my family, and that I was a role model for them. And then the other guy, well, he was sitting there and he was thinking, and he was like, I wish somebody were standing by my casket and they would point and say, look, he's moving. I'm sorry. I know. I just couldn't help it, and it only marginally relates to this sermon, but I thought it was funny, okay? All right, so back to our faith saving us. Get the link there? Anyway, so 2 Corinthians 5:7, Paul says this, we live by faith, not by what? Sight. We don't live by sight. We don't live by that, although most of us do live by that, but what I'm saying is he's encouraging us, don't live that way. As followers of Christ, we don't. Can you imagine what it's like to live by sight? How about every time you look at the balance in your checkbook? How does that feel for you? Is there a lot of hope there? How about every time you watch your stock, where's that going? If you're living by sight, that's a painful thing. How about when you watch the news? How about these days? Good grief. If you lived by sight and you're a news watcher, what do you think about the world we live in? Where's your hope? You look at all the tragedy and the struggle and the painful, awful things that happen. You look at the typhoon that just, ran over the Philippines and 10,000 dead at this point. Man, if you looked at all that and that's all you had was just how you live by sight, you would think this is a pretty desperate place. I don't have much hope. That's why Paul says, see, we don't live that way. We can look at those things, but we look beyond those things. We look above those things. And you know what we see? We see a God who is over all that. He is sovereign. He reigns over all that. None of this surprises him. And in the end, he weaves everything together for our good and his glory. And we have to believe that. That's living by faith, is that we trust that he will do that. Now, let me make this real practical for you. There are some things that faith doesn't do, and then there are some things that faith does do specifically. So let me mention a few of these. I'm not big in the laundry list, but I thought this was pretty good. Here you go. First of all, faith does not shield us from physical suffering. And I say this because I think that maybe sometimes we might believe this, or maybe there are others who believe this, but we might think that, look, because I have this strong faith in God, therefore I shouldn't suffer. I shouldn't go through hard times. I shouldn't suffer physically. I shouldn't get cancer. I shouldn't have an accident. I shouldn't have these things happen in my life. And we might get sort of this jaded sort of view of life in that way. And it's like we have to be reminded that the Bible says the rain falls on the just and the unjust. What does that mean? The rain falls on everybody. We're all going to go through it. It's just the difference is those with the faith in Christ are going to get through it a whole lot better with a lot more hope. And we'll know that God is with us. It does not shield us from the loss of earthly possessions. Again, and there are some people who would say that if you have a strong faith, you should be happy, wealthy, and wise. You should have lots of money and lots of things coming in and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, got to be careful with that. That's not what the Bible says. In fact, we may end up poor with very little, and you know what? If we have our faith, we'll be the richest person in the world because our earthly possessions mean nothing. So we might lose them, and that might be the biggest blessing that we have, honestly. It does not guarantee ease. Jesus, he reminded his followers, man, you get on this path, it's kind of up and down and rough, but I'm with you. I'll travel it with you. But it's not always easy. And it does not shield us from grief. The unfortunate reality of the life that we live now is that death is still a reality. And people close to us will die. We will all die. There's your hopeful thought for the day. But anyway, Thanks, Rusty. You get that on Facebook. Rusty said we'll all die. Okay, happy. But we're reminded that grief is a reality. And some of us, even maybe this morning, know that maybe more than some others. But it's okay. Because you know what? I have watched God shine in the midst of people's grief in a way that he just can't shine anyplace else. Because he's so strong, he's so comforting, he's so sure in those moments. So those are just a few things that faith does not do, just so that we understand this. Now, what does faith do? Faith saves. I mean, in the very pinnacle, the very biggest issue here is that our faith saves us. Saves us from what? Saves us from despair and discouragement and hopelessness and all these things. But at the end of our life, it saves us from death. It brings us to life. So that when our physical body dies here, man, our spirit lives for eternity in heaven. That's what our faith does for us. Very important, right? Our faith justifies us. Before we even get to that point, our faith allows us to stand before the Lord clean and right because of what Jesus did on the cross. When we trust in Jesus and what he did on the cross, okay, then our faith justifies us, makes us right. Now, we didn't do it for ourselves. God does this for us. But that's what allows us to be justified before him. Our faith stabilizes us. Paul, in this Ephesians 6 earlier, talks about how all this armor and the war and all this kind of stuff helps us stand firm. And he says, at the end of the day, at the end of all this, you want to stand and then stand again. Stand some more. So our faith is what allows us to firmly plant our feet in the midst of whatever comes. And we want that, don't we? We need that. Our faith strengthens us, and trust me, we can't do this life under our own strength. And some of you already know that. You can testify that this morning. We need God's strength. But our faith is what strengthens us and helps us in those difficult times. Our faith sings. And then you might be like, what does that mean? What if I don't sing? All right, hang in there. Here's what I mean by that. Even through the most difficult and trying circumstances, when we are discouraged and maybe even in pain, it's our faith what allows us to be able to do things like come here on Sunday morning and sing these songs. And while I'm struggling, I'm still able to sing about God's love for me, my trust in him, my faith in him. A couple of weeks ago, you remember the shooting that happened in the Los Angeles airport? That was a big deal all over the news and all this kind of stuff. Well, somebody from our church was actually in that airport. Julie Feehan, some of you may know her. She was out in Los Angeles, and she was in the airport when that happened. And she called and told me about it afterwards, but she said that while they were there, they were at a terminal that was right next to the terminal while all this started taking place. And that somebody came running in, and TSA agent, and said, everybody out, and everybody didn't know what to think because they hadn't heard of anything at this point. So they just stood there, and then finally, they just started yelling, everybody out right now, your life depends on it, everybody out, everybody out. All of a sudden, this stampede of people just start rushing, down the hall, not really knowing where to go, but they had somebody leading them. They took them to another place in the airport, and they kind of told them, stay here, be still, don't move. And one of the TSA agents came up and said, here's the deal. We've got 2 active shooters in the airport. We don't know where they are, so we're in the line of fire. I want everybody to be quiet, be still, and be calm. Be calm? Anyway, so she was like, that's when the anxiety really started for her and for everybody else in there. And, I was like, oh, my gosh. But eventually they ushered them out of there. They got them out of the airport to another airport where they stayed for hours, and then they flew them to Charlotte, North Carolina, and they stayed there, slept in a chair overnight. It was just a very difficult thing until finally she gets back to Auburn. Well, she was here last Sunday in church, and she was worshiping, even though the anxiety and the fear were still very real for her. And if you were here last week, you'll remember the last song that we sang, part of the lyrics said, I'm alive, I'm alive. And she starts singing that. Gets about halfway through the first one and just starts breaking down tears, because she's thinking, you know what, I am alive. And I'm not just alive physically, but I'm alive because of who God is and what he's done in my life. You see, your faith allows you to stand up and sing that because of what God has done. And he's with me through everything in all circumstances. Then the last thing is faith sends us out. Our faith, when Jesus changes you, when he gives you new life, it should affect you so deeply that you can't contain that. Somehow it's got to come out. It's got to come out in how you deal with your family, with your friends, with your loved ones. It's a faith that takes you out to get this word of hope to somebody else. It's a faith that takes our church out, sends us out because there's a message that this world needs to hear that's life-saving as well as life-changing. And so our faith is what sends us out. It doesn't keep us still. Let me read this quote for you. St. Thomas Aquinas, who was an Italian Catholic priest, said this: God destines us for an end beyond the grasp of reason. God destines us for an end beyond the grasp of reason, beyond what we can reason out and think in our mind. There is this other thing that will take us all the way to heaven in the end, and that is our faith. Now, quickly, so that I don't lose some of you, does that mean that we throw reason and science out the window? Absolutely not. Does it mean we remove our brain just so that we can have faith? No. In fact, the beautiful thing is that science and reason and faith all come together. They're all pieces of the story of God that He is writing. And we need all of those things to come together to see the whole picture. That's what I love about that. But to be clear, at the end, faith is what saves us. Paul says in Ephesians 2:8 and 9, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Saved by that faith. In Romans 10:9 and 10, it says, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be what? Saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. It is with your mouth that you profess your what? Faith, and are saved. Faith is integral to this salvation. And we have to have grasped that in order to move from this life to the next. Now, that's individual. Next thing is just corporate. Really, what Paul is talking about here in Ephesians 6 is more of a corporate faith. That the shields and the armor and all this kind of stuff is so that we can do this together, so that we can live this faith out together. And that's an important part of it. And back then, the Roman soldiers, when they put their shields together, is when they were stronger. Now, real quick, I've got a movie clip I want to show you. Movie Gladiator. Hey, where are you going? Let me set this up. I saw that. I don't want to be in the dark. Come on. No talk back. What is this? Anyway, so let me set this up, and then we'll turn the lights on. It'll be great. So, movie Gladiator. Anybody see this? Oh, come on. It's the best movie ever. All right. If you haven't seen it, it's a little gory, so there's your warning. But anyway, so at this point, Russell Crowe has all of his other slaves, who've been turned into gladiators, and they're required to fight in the arena, right? And the folks they were fighting were soldiers, and they were very equipped for this. And basically, they were just meat. They were just being thrown into the arena to be killed and to satisfy the masses. So that was the whole point. But Russell Crowe has a plan. I love Russell Crowe. And he's like, all right, guys, we're going to do this thing together. And I won't tell you. Let's just go ahead. Now you can turn the lights out and let's show this clip. Want to watch the rest of the movie? Yeah. So great. Just that imagery, that illustration of they were meant to be defeated. They were meant to not survive this. But Russell pulls them together strategically and says, no. If we do this together, we can survive this. And what you don't see in this clip is one guy who decides to go off on his own and is ugly. What happens to that guy? But anyway, he didn't make it. So the point is that for us, very similarly, spiritually, when our faith is linked together, you and me, us as a church, as a family, as we do this together, we are stronger. We are better together. Let's put it that way. We are better together, always. The Bible talks about that from beginning to end. Individually, we stand before the Lord, but while we're on this earth, we're better together. That we need each other. We are literally, like the flanges on those shields are designed to link together. You and I are designed to be linked together with others. We're not designed to live this life by ourselves, isolated. When you're off by yourself, it's just more likely or easier to be picked off by the enemy. And God encourages us to do this thing together. Now, there are some things that will keep us from doing that, I know. Things like shame. You know, if we have a difficult past or life, if we get into a group, say a small group, and man, do I have to share that? And if I do, what are people going to think of me? Well, what if they think, wow, you should hear my story? Because I'll bet there'll be a lot of grace when you find out that somebody else has got one that's probably worse than yours. And you're like, well, it could be worse. But sometimes when we share with each other and we open up and we drop the wall and we drop the mask, you know, God does his best work in us. Or sometimes it's fear. Fear keeps us from linking shields together. Pride. How about pride? Pride will keep us isolated into ourselves, saying, you know what, I got this life. I can do it by myself. I can do this thing on my own. You know what the Bible says about pride? It goes for a fall. It always goes before a fall. So we have to be careful with that. We have to be willing to engage with other people in doing this faith thing together. Again, because we are better together, as Russell Crowe was saying, as one. And you know, I think about as a church, we are better as one. We are better together. And you know what? Satan would love no more than for you to sit off isolated, to become apathetic or comfortable, or to sit up in the stands, you know, and kind of watch everybody else do the work and volunteer and serve and give. You know, it's like, hey, y'all go, you're doing the thing. I'll be right up here if you need me. We're not good up there. We're better when we're on the field. We're better when we're engaged in what God is doing, and we're serving, and we're plugging in, and we're moving out and doing all these things that God needs us to do, because we keep the enemy at bay. Instead of shooting arrows at each other, you know, we start finding that enemy and say, let's go after him. He's the problem, not you and me. It's him. Because we're better as one. Better together.